and we're now about to discover why we're even having this conversation. I think probably it started when Gerhard connected us a few months ago. He had you on his podcast, me on his podcast. I think you two had met before that. And he said, "You got to meet Gitte. You got to meet Gitte." And I was like, "Okay, let's talk. Let's see what happens." And then we had a conversation, and we realized that, hey, this is not one conversation we need to have. We need to unpack quite a few topics. And we very quickly landed on this sort of tricky topic of masculinity, femininity, the current spiritual angles, somatic angles, and then you revealed that you're actually a women's coach. So I was wondering now, like, what was it that initially made you curious to have these conversations with this random Frenchman in Finland that was literally an unknown person to you a few months ago? What was it that made you curious about having these conversations?
Well, actually, it was, of course, also Gerhard that was as happy about that meeting. And I already told you this, but I think it's still funny to share here, is that he was like really selling you, like, yeah, you should like really meet this guy, and like you have so much in common, and like everything like you do with the female, he does with the masculine. And it was like so much that I was actually wondering, like, is this like a business? Is this a new friend, or is it a blind date? and and then you did the podcast first with the topic also of masculinity, and I heard it and I thought it was really interesting, and also yeah, some triggers there. And I thought, like, for sure this sounds like a man I want to meet and chat up. So that was my way in.
So just so anybody who's listening to this is a very different type of conversation we're having. Rather than us going into podcast mode of just like, "Hi, we're great, you're great, I'm great, we're all wonderful. Here are my social handles, and here are yours." We're literally taking a very different approach here. We're having more like a coffee conversation in our kitchen and lounge. And the idea of this is to have an emergent dialogue, meaning that we go beyond the discussion, beyond the small talk, and what I would call the motorways of thinking, where we just hash out what the ready-made thinking that other people have put on the table, and really start to look at things from a real personal experience perspective, both from your hat, with your professional hat as a women's coach, also your personal, life experience as a woman. Same thing for me, my ethnography hat, communication hat, looking at things, as well as a personal hat of me being a man in relation. And that is the idea of these 5 sessions, is that we're going to have first one where we open up why we even having this conversation. The second and third is going to be exploration, where we're exploring those topics from different angles. And eventually, the idea, which might change, is that we would end up co-creating some kind of online ritual, not just on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of a general, more collective archetypal view of the feminine and the masculine. And maybe some kind of ritual around that would lead towards harmony and forgiveness of something, or not. Let's see what happens, what emerges. There's no guarantees. So that was really the framing. And then if you're listening, we do have the chat. We can see what you're chatting, but we are mostly just having this conversation as a casual human conversation. So, Gitte.
Coffee chat.
Cough, yeah. I have also my glass of water, which is invisible because of my green screen. Let's maybe just dive into what was it that got you into the topic of the conscious feminine. Like you became a women's coach for a reason. Could start from there, maybe.
Yeah, my cheeky answer would be being born as a woman. uh, I think it's always been something that I find very interesting, to be honest, because I had an aunt that was very feminist, and since I was like 8, she was like teaching me stuff about like not being depending on men, and see like the whole balance of how the female and the masculine are actually interacting. And also, being a pretty straightforward person, I realized that I wasn't met out in the world in the same way as both like more softer or feminine females. And also doing the same as male did wasn't what I got back if I did the same. And to be honest, it really started as curiosity. And I think especially it like got more professional for me after I got a divorce 10 years ago. And I felt there were so many processes myself that I needed to look at as a female who have left the institution of marriage. And it was like a resetting of everything because I hadn't been on a date for like 12 years and you were a completely different person. So what did I want? Who was I? And how was my interaction with the other sex or the masculine? So I think, to be honest, that's how it actually started.
So that could be a cheeky answer, or it could be a very simple answer, because I mean, gender is not just a matter of body; it's also a social construct, and a lot of people make a huge distinction about that and want to distinguish those two things: the biological construct. So I was born also into a very pro-feminine environment, family of teachers, very strong women, both sides, grandparents, strong women, very opinionated women, quite even dominating women. And I sort of grew up with this idea that men are inferior to women. It took me a long time to actually even come to terms with being a man, thinking that, I don't really deserve to be happy because I'm a man. I'm part of the
Wow.
evil sex. So I had to go through a healing and forgiveness path. I also have a similar story as you did with the divorce. Like, I had a first marriage that ended up in a divorce, and I think part of it is to do also with not just gender roles, but the polarity that goes with the gender, the sort of what is expected in polarity of lead follow from the gender role. And then also probably a lot of shame from my side of being, having my own opinions and drives and not necessarily wanting to impose them on my ex-wife. I then fast forward, went
Mm-hmm.
to Finland, got a period of complete freedom and being really explorative of those topics, did some tantra. Now I'm in a very beautiful relation with Anu, and she's like this sort of like almost, I treat her as almost like a goddess, in the sense that she's representing more than just a life partner. But that journey was a long and very painful process of self healing. And so I don't really call myself a masculinity coach. And I'm actually quite nervous about this conversation, because I've had so many tricky conversations with men and women about the topic that it took me years to even voice these topics, because of the triggers that they generated in particularly actually men who would go, "What is this all about?" Yeah. So, and by the way, I think in the conversation, I'm going to take a French role, which is we can talk to think, meaning we don't have to have ready-made clever thinking, and also let's interrupt each other as a sign of enthusiasm. Don't worry about interrupting. So
Thank you for saying that. I both love to interrupt, but also to like go out on a limb on different things. And
mhm.
I actually also like, and I think for me that's been part of my exploration to actually not try and deliberately trigger people, but this is a topic where you will push buttons.
Mm,
And I think like because it made me really curious what you said with your growing up, because I think like a lot of both men and females are scared of the feminine because there is like a very aggressive feminine. And what I always say is like, because I've been there when I first got married, I was like, fuck men, and like they're just abusers and blah, blah, blah. And you get these angry women standing on a mountaintop screaming at the other mountaintop where the men is standing and you did that,
yeah,
and it
yeah.
just becomes such a shit show. And if you as a female approach both men and females like that, people will just like go into like the shell for defense.
Mm,
So for me, I think it's so important to have this conversation from a place of love. And there
mm,
is a lot of fucked up things both ways. And I think it's just more voiced the female things, but there is also so much unawareness that I passionately burn to put into words and thoughts and awareness as everyone else out there. And it's not meant as an attack or you did this wrong. But it's like, hey, are you realizing that this is actually going on? And both with men and females, because females, a lot of them are also unaware of that.
And I think the topic of conflict is how I kind of got into this. So I started came to Finland about 10 years ago, and when I came, I was a cultural alien. Like, I didn't dress like this. I dressed like a normal office worker. I didn't have long hair. I had normal hair, and for normal, notice normal again, gendering. And then I realized that I was triggering people, and what they were saying was that they were being triggered by me being too masculine in some workplaces. I had some leather bracelets. I had this sort of, sometimes I would wear stage things. I was a trainer. I was doing workshops in companies. And for me, the aim was to show distance from ego. In other words, if you can laugh at yourself with costumes, you're free from your ego. What they were interpreting was the person was trying to make a gender statement. And so I was being gendered in the workplace, an undesirable toxic male, when literally all I was doing is being culturally different, i.e., more enthusiastic, slightly more joyful, and quite sort of determined to actually open difficult conversations up. And I had no idea that some people were getting triggered. It was generally women, or gender neutral or non-binary people who were coming to say to me, like, you have no idea what you're talking about. So I literally went and did my homework. I went to a course. I went trained as a tantra teacher. I went to the most inclusive form of tantra, where they talk about non-binary as the baseline. Learned how to talk about it. And when I came back to these same training places, I was triggering people even more, because I was using the language that I was taught is the most progressive, woke language. I was triggering people even more because there was a literal lack of understanding. And so I started looking at conflicts, and I realized that what we understand today as conflicts is generally thought of as negative conflicts in the Nordics, whereas in fact, a conflict is a tension. So the metaphor I use in my head, which is why I'm now working with music, is that think of a tension as a guitar string. It's not a bad thing. It's just really good to harmonize that tension with other guitar strings or instruments, and that the tensions are not the problem. It's how we construe and deal with those tensions, and
Yeah.
are we harmonizing and tuning our tensions with each other. So then, instead of looking at all the triggers that people are having as problems, we see them as tensions that can be left as they are, and a huge form of creative potential. And then that shifted the whole narrative from being problem to, how about we, that's why I sort of started this topic together with you as a harmonizing, is that it's not about removing triggers and tensions. To me, it was started to be more about, like, okay, well, if there is a misunderstanding and a gender divide and a war almost between genders, like,
Yeah.
how do we start creating peace within ourselves around that?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, and I think it's important to like voice this, that it's not a conflict. And I think it's just also like a general issue for people. Like, so many people are like living like this in their own little bubble, and any sort of conflict, chaos, or pain is a threat. So they react by pushing people away or closing down even
Mm,
further. And it's difficult when you come from this point of view. I'm known for being like pretty straightforward, as I already said, and I speak my truth. And I
mm,
sometimes I really need to say people like, I need to say something, but I want you to know that this really comes from love. Because it can also be boundaries. It can also be, yeah, like bringing the elephant into the room. There is like so many ways of doing it. And I think communication is like so important. I love communication, and also I have a bachelor in communication. And how we communicate and how we word things, how we use our voices and our whole attitude is like so important. And most people are not aware of this, and that's also where conflict or chaos come in.
mm,
And we haven't learned to deal with it, especially within the sexes and within
mm.
ourselves as well. So it's like we need to go there before we can even take the next step.
Yeah, and it's the I think what you already said is that the intention is one of the unlocking factors. It doesn't matter what we really say, as long as we're clear with our intentions expressed. Like if we're coming from the intention of love and connection, it's very different than coming from the intention of reaffirming a pain or a pain body or some past trauma,
Yeah.
and having validation for that past trauma by the conversation. Those are two different angles to start from. In fact, when I started to measure communication, we measured triggers, ego triggers, and we thought gender was going to be one of the top ones that gets people upset. It wasn't actually. Guess what was the number one trigger that we had?
How you raise your child.
That's actually, it was quite high up as well. Like parenting was quite, it was behaviors. Now, behavior
Mm,
is so interesting because it is gendered. Like, for example, there are, that's how often people think of gender, is through the different types of behaviors that people might take: soft, hard, loud, not loud, mansplaining, not, those behavioral things is actually
yeah.
the number one global trigger for conflicts across all cultures that we measured. And the funny thing about that is that every single behavior is cultural and context dependent. So if I'm interrupting you, this is why I mentioned the interruption earlier. If I'm interrupting you in Finland, people will automatically assume it means I'm disinterested, disrespectful, and impatient. Whereas in France, it can mean that you're enthusiastic. So the context in which you are, very same behavior has a very significance. And if we don't know those differences, we can both fall into that sort of misunderstanding trap, which basically I think is most of the conflicts I've seen between gender are literally just misunderstandings of intention and what behaviors actually mean, why we doing what we do, not what we do itself. So I just put the behavior there because what was it? Was it my behavior that was triggering you the first time you heard? Like you said, you had this when we were talking on
Yeah.
the.
No, no, not at all. It was actually that I felt it was super interesting, like the different topics you had. You were talking, I think, and this is something I also want to unfold with you. You were talking a lot about the genders within, like your inner male and female. And that's very interesting. I think personally, I'm also very interesting in like the polarity and also like, do we actually need to voice some of these boundaries that are being pushed? And I feel like a lot of time when bad things are happening, like all the Me Too and rapes and assaults, like when I try to talk with men about it, they really don't get it. A lot of males really don't get what you are doing to females or what it's like to be a female because you are on top of the pyramid. Like a white male would rather be a black male than a female. And it's like the things that we go through as life, and I'm not saying this as a victim because I'm pretty sure you have yours as well, but it's like I saw this great meme where a male and a female were on the start line to, I don't know the English word, when you run and you have to like
Mm,
jump fences.
mm,
And like at the female one, there was like laundry, picking up the kids, um, 5 and 8 things, and males were just running. And I think it's really important to, I think everyone wants that, to feel seen and heard and understood. So for me, it triggered me that you didn't bring that topic at all into the podcast. And I don't
mm,
know what comes first. Do you need to find your own balance first before you can do it? Do you need to interact, male, female? Do you need female groups, men groups? Like, is there even like a right way of doing it? But I think it's
mm.
very important to bring awareness to all the unconscious outside of us because that's also affecting how we feel and think inside.
It's interesting that the takeaway was that as well, because like I had this long conversation with Gerhard before about, do we want to use polarity, i.e., the Asian approach to labeling polarity, which is lead, follow, yin, yang, or do we want to simplify it to masculine, feminine, which is what the Western approach is often doing, which has its
Yeah.
downside, which means that we kind of assume that yin is feminine and yang is masculine, which is actually not the case, because we know already that both the masculine and the feminine have their own form of lead and follow, which are actually quite different if we look at them. And the Asians usually use animals to describe that. The masculine is the canine dog, and the feminine is feline. And so you can have a yang masculine would be the wolf, a yin masculine would be the dog, a yang feminine would be the tiger, and the yin feminine would be the cat. So there's four animals: cat, dog, wolf, tiger. And that creates a complexity which many people are not willing to open up, because it's hard enough to even talk about the misunderstandings between a binary perspective. But when you bring four, let alone 100 different ways of construing it, it becomes a complete mess to talk about it outside. And then we just go within the inner shell of experience. So the intention I had with Gerhard was to try and create a simplicity to it by using the idea of masculine and feminine internally. But I'd rather use yin and yang as a polarity with when you and I talk about it, because I think it's more accurate and less actually trapping to think that we have an internal masculine and internal feminine. I think we actually have an internal yin and an internal yang dynamic, which are potentially different for genders or not, depending on the person's approach to gender. So that was, you were going to say something, or shall I just jump onto the next direction?
I'm just like enjoying what you're saying and thinking about it.
It's been a topic that I've been investigating recently a lot, because the narrative of women have a difficult time and when men have it easy is basically what I grew up with, at the same time as being the guy at home doing the laundry and being the sort of archetypal ideal man by being the man who brings in the money, but also who's at home with the children, who's also the sensitive partner. So literally I was ticking all the boxes of what current society is labeling as the ideal sensitive man, and my polarity was messed up with my partner. Why? Because I had automatically, she was Polish, and I, with hindsight, was compensating for her being in a foreign country. So I was always saying yes, I was always allowing her lead as a strong woman to take over my. I was so afraid of being labeled as the dominant male that I did the opposite. I was constantly yes, 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 following her lead. And I think that cost us our sexual polarity. It also cost us our relationship. And there's probably many other reasons too. But when I realized that, when I came single and I started dating and started exploring Tantra, I realized that there is a huge difference between being in the masculine and feminine and being in the lead and the follow. And you can actually be in both as a lead, in both as a follow. But then comes a very tricky question. And then what is the masculine and feminine?
That was what I was
so
going
volatile.
to say. And what is it? And like, what is healthy masculinity? What is healthy femininity? And for me, it's actually just awareness, because like what I work with a lot of females about is like we are being taught from like tiny little girls to be like pleasers and smile and be aware of our surroundings so we can serve. And I know this comes like very stereotypic, but that is like how it is. And I can say in Denmark that I see as a very liberal country, a female in general does 1 hour more work at home every day. So like there isn't any equalness at all. And also I think like as a female, if we talk about different like female archetypes, I think a lot of females go into, I like to like think of it as like a Virgin Mary energy, where we need to just take care of everything. We need to be so soft and loving and just yes, and no, we can have our opinion, but we need to be polite about them and smile at the same time. And for me, I personally love like going more into like a Kali or Freya or whatever you want to call it energy, where like, no, I'm a roaring ocean and I would love for you to be my host, but like, don't. And a lot of both men and female, in my opinion, fear that, because that's not what we are taught. That's not what we've seen throughout latest history, and latest, I'll say like 1,000 year plus. So I think like both the female and of course also the masculine, I'm just talking from a female point of view because that's what I'm living mostly, is like we should know all of these different sides of us. Because I think for me, like my name of my company, Mother North, for me, the North is like the wild, it's the cold, it's the untamed. But I also have the mother side of me where I would protect my kids and I'll take care of society and I'm giving life. So it's for me about awareness and exploring. And if you are a Mother Mary figure, beautiful. I love that. But just make sure that you are not suppressing the wilder, the untamed energy in you.
Mm. It's like if we were to remove gender construct, which is one of the ideas behind this, is that let's remove the gender construct, let's have non-binary thinking, but there is still in society a huge like inertia. And one of the things I was watching that changed a little bit my thinking was this documentary called Beyond Men and Masculinity, which
Mm-hmm.
was like I don't know if you've seen this one.
No.
Eye-opening for me and a lot of male friends who watched this, and who some of them even looped watched it. They watched it several times, and it basically addresses the humongous patriarchal trauma that is put on men without women noticing. In other words, women are also conniving to recreating the patriarchal toxic models, but men are also victims of it, particularly if they're not the so-called alpha males at the top who are calling the shots and being those so-called arrogant toxic men. So if you're trying to actually do your homework spiritually, look in the mirror, be vulnerable, what is very clear is that men are very often in a box. So if we say that men are educated to be pleasers and smile, men are educated to not show emotion.
Yeah.
And that creates this pent up phenomenon that when something does eventually become too much, it can explode into violence or aggression that is obviously unwelcome. And so I was exploring this topic, and at first I wanted to do a men women's group to explore this, and I realized that the men were not comfortable talking in front of women. They were afraid of the women. And so I thought, let's do a men's group. And then I talked to some men and we started putting some time down, and many men were afraid of talking with each other. So there's still not just shame, there's a
Can I
huge
be
amount.
really annoying and interrupt you here? Because like
Yeah, yeah,
this,
yeah, yeah.
I really feel for what you're saying, and I think what you're saying is very important. But I just want to add a little thing. Margaret Atwood, I think her name is the one who wrote The Handmaid's Tale. She quoted that males are afraid of being ridiculed by women. Women are afraid of being raped and murdered by men.
Mm,
I just think that that's an important point because I do understand that what you're going through as well is difficult and there is so much that needs to change. But also, I think we need to see like this is two different points of
mm,
levels of problem. Not that it's a competition at all, but we both need to own up. And a lot of mothers need to own up for how they are raising their sons.
mm. And I would say also the definition of privilege is of being able to not have a conversation. So if a man is not willing to have a conversation about gender, it's generally because they have the privilege of being in that position of not having to have that conversation. At the same time, some of the men have been talking to me have been subject to rape from other men. I don't think rape is a gender problem. It's more obviously statistically likely that a woman gets raped than a man, but many men have been raped as well. I'll just put that out because a lot of men who are dealing with rape trauma from other men are literally in the same bucket as being completely unable to talk about it as some women who feel men partly responsible. Psychologically, it's I don't say it's more damaging, but it's there. And I think the equality topic to me is incomplete without talking about equity. Gender equity is seldom mentioned because we focus a lot on equality, but equality is where we are today. We need to build equality on certain things that are undeniably important, like pay, opportunities, access to jobs, and time use. But then the next question that's a lot harder is equity. Like, what are the differences in gender and how should they be accounted for? And if there are no differences, then equity disappears. and then we have a society where all genders are treated with the same needs when we know that there are certain gendered needs. For example, right now, women have certain needs, men have certain needs, which are, even though we wouldn't want them to be in the current, they are still there. So how do we deal with those needs to the degree that they're needed, rather than, because let's say that a man's need is to learn how to deal with anger, and a woman's need, if I'm caricaturing, might be uh, a different need. How do we actually account for that without creating the same blanket solution for everybody who's going through their personal growth? What are your thoughts on that? Because it's
Yeah, I think for me it's always awareness, because so much of this is also put into us as kids. And I
mm,
remember like one thing that really makes a deep impression on me, like after my divorce, I was talking to a friend and I was like really giving him a hard time because I was in the angry feminine at that point. And at some point, he was like, whoa, you really need to slow down. I started going into my emotions when I was like 25. So you have around 23 years more experience in handling,
mm,
feeling, and talking about emotions than me.
mm,
And I was like, damn, that's
yeah,
right. And
yeah,
we all learned that as females. Like we play house when we're two, that's or
mm,
how we start already there dealing with emotions and other people's need and how we feel. And so I really feel that we should be aware of this. And there have been so many studies, kindergarten, public schools, high schools, university, where like the facilitators, like the teachers or the child take care, I've lost that word, taking care
yeah,
of the kid.
yeah,
They knew they were filmed, but they were still acting so differently around male and female, even like in
mm,
kindergarten and also at university. So I think we really need to bring awareness into this field. Like, what are the things we are missing? How are we holding each other in these wrong or like locked in polarities that's not healthy for any of us, because we are missing out. Like
mm,
we can unfold our own masculine and feminine, and we can use each other so much, because I think that's one of my really important points to bring is we do need each other as male
mm.
and female. Like of course everyone should be whole on their own, but we still need each other, and we can really lift each other and elevate each other if we can find that balance or that polarity and make it work.
The polarity is something that, like, I identified because we started measuring polarity in the workplace in terms of lead follow dynamics, and I found a correlation between polarity and sexual tension. Now, because in the general sense, people confuse polarity with gender. In other words, yang is often associated to be masculine, yin, feminine, which, by the way, comes from a misunderstanding of the Asian philosophy that came a few hundred years ago through the Silk Road back to Europe, with the influence into this very binary man woman thinking. Whereas if we think we remove the gender issue, let's say that we harmonize all gender and that gender is not an issue, we don't gender people at school, parents understand that their human being is a human, a non-binary human. What has happened, I've noticed in some circles which are very aware of non-binary, is that they also lose the polarity. Because if we don't have a clear understanding of polarity, when we remove the gender construct, what then happens is that there is a loss of that polarity and passion in the sexual sense. In Tantra, we would talk about only the polarity, not the gender, and say, okay, well, when there isn't the polarity, how does that like sexual tension unfold? Does it then become entirely spiritual? And that's where white Tantra becomes very strong, which is like more spiritual. But then the physical red Tantra disappears because there isn't that polarity of lead and follow. So I've been experimenting with this. And what I found is that if people understand that polarity is a different thing than gender, and they learn to play, for example, a polarity game. I've been hosting a few experimental evenings here in this flat with polarity games where I have like 6 couples, and they're sometimes individuals, sometimes they're straight, sometimes they're gay, sometimes they're bi. Sometimes they're non-binary. It's really not about people coming to meet a man, woman. And we just, at first they're terrified. They're going like, but I'm not interested in that person's gender. It's like, it doesn't matter. Don't focus on their gender. Focus on their polarity. The game goes like this: 10 minutes, you play, you lead, and then you have to ask for what you really want. Rule of respect. The other one says no. You say thank you, not sorry. And I'm just simplifying the game. And then 10 minutes you switch, and the other one does the same, and then you follow. And what happens is that many people are completely uncomfortable in one of those two polarities, and it's not to do with their gender.
Mm-hmm.
And most often, people are very uncomfortable being in the yang, both men and women.
Oh.
It's very common. People yin, I go in like, oh, it's much. Ask me what you want, I'll say yes or no. Whereas when they say, okay, it's time for me to decide what I want, what if they don't want? What if they give me a no? What if they say yes and I actually have to receive? All those things become problematic. And then they freeze. A number of times in those parties, I've seen people literally freeze and go, I don't know what to ask. And then it's like a beautiful insight when we do the checkout circle about, well, why? Why was it so difficult? And the men find it difficult because they don't want to be seen as dominating. The women are often saying that they don't know because they're not actually sure really what they want, and they're not sure if they can just ask for whatever they want, and is that going to be received, and there's insecurity there. And so it becomes quite visible that there was a lack of yang. And so somebody at the end said, I actually realized that it takes a lot of courage to be yang, and I'm now feeling grateful to whoever, whatever gender they are, when they're being yang. I'm suddenly noticing that that is hard, and I'm grateful. Rather than despising that lead, I'm actually grateful for somebody taking that initiative and saying whatever they did in that lead moment. So I just wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, to be honest, because like I also am hosting with a colleague a space called Raise Up Academy for Women. And last week we did a Zoom meeting, and like the topic was filling your own cup. And it like evolved into how difficult it actually is to receive. And we decided, it was a female group, that it was way easier for men to receive. And for females, we are not taught that it's okay for us to receive. So I think like actually most women do know what they want, and they are just not being taught that it's okay to ask for what we want.
So
And
that
I
is
think there's like
fascinating.
there. And I'm just going to also say, this is like a little push I like to do. If anyone questioned that, just wonder like, why do we have Alexa and Siri? This is a whole new generation of men being taught that women are here to serve. And also us. I'm just like,
So maybe that's why I changed my CD voice to a male voice, which made me smile. I chose a Scottish accent. I love the
so cool.
Scottish accent.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
in terms of I've been hearing exactly the opposite. I've heard the women were saying in the groups that I've tested this in that the men find it even harder to receive than the women. So I think there's something interesting in that what we construe as giving and receiving is different than what we actually ask.
I think it's more about if you're conscious about it, because there is so many ways. We can just look at a regular Western intercourse. Like an intercourse ends when a man have an orgasm. And I'm like, okay, what about us? And it's like, oh yeah, but like it's harder for a female to have an orgasm or to come. And I think also it's way more, oral sex is way more like for the guy than for the girl. And I know this is generalizing and this is on purpose. So I think like also about like serving food and doing like domestic things. It's like when we're not aware, there is so much there. But if you sit two people in front and you ask a man, I want you to feel what you need. So it's not about the need or receive, it's about feeling within, in my opinion.
You're bringing sex on the table, which is wonderful. So let's go there because, like as I said, I've been exploring that topic. The what you're describing is obviously the archetypal porn-driven view of society, which is not fortunately what everybody, and I'm
Majority.
very, yeah, it's also, I think there's a huge educational element to this as well, about what men and women's bodies are capable of feeling in terms of pleasure, which is not even understood. Like, I'm part of this bubble of sex positive people in Helsinki, which is basically open-minded people, sex parties, and there we see very different reality than in the
For
traditional
sure.
bedroom. And there,
Absolutely.
generally men are more the servants, actually, and the women the queens. Generally the
As we are
men are more
supposed.
the bumblebees, as it as one could say, supposed to be. But I think this is where I think it's tempting for us to start going on to comparison of the two genders without having really been either one of us fully in the other gender.
For sure.
And I think maybe of course the comparison is always going to be coming from a space of legitimacy, like, am I legitimate in doing this because the gender is this, and so on. So I wanted to invite us to sort of step beyond that and go, either we then both go and cross dress and go to a sex party and come back and debrief, or we then talk about it from a point of view of harmonizing those different perspectives. Because what I've noticed in conversation circles around sex is that literally every problem that a woman faces, a man is facing too, in equivalent ways, and vice versa. So basically, as much as we want to gender them, I've noticed that, for example, we had this one format with two circles, men in the middle, women on the outside, and women change afterwards, go to the center. So it's like in turns, and it doesn't matter which way we do it. Generally, it's sort of a conversation where the center circle is talking about a topic, and the outer circle is listening actively to understand. And then you switch, and the topics are given by the other circle. So, for example, the women enter, the men throw a question to the circle for the women to discuss together or talk about together, and
Yeah.
then we switch, and then the women do the same. And generally in those circles, when you do it long enough, you'll find literally every opinion and every experience is possible in every gender. That's the sort of what I've noticed. So even though we could make a case that, for example, women find it harder to receive, men find it hard to receive, we don't have, quite frankly, statistics on those things because they're so under researched. That what would be interesting is to sort of actually do 50 years of longitudinal research on the realities of people's behaviors in the closed bedrooms of their relationships, not what we assume based on society's Netflix motorways of thinking, which is what we see as society. Because when we really go down to the bottom of it, I see a lot of men and women who have trauma around gendering.
I think like going into like I mostly agree. And I think it's very interesting because I when I talk to people, because like as you as well, I'm also into the tantra, and as it sometimes bring like random, really interesting conversations, and I have
Mm,
had them with both sexes. And men are actually like really interested. And at first I was like, okay, this is going to be a lot of men hitting on me. But it was actually
mm,
like an invitation for men to be really vulnerable and ask me questions, but also me like saying like, have you thought about this or what about that? And it shows me that there is so little awareness. It is, as you say, like a lot of us grow up in some way and see porn or just whatever is on streaming or TV, and we think like that's the formula.
mm,
And none really like inviting us to explore that at all. And I think, as we both know, diving deeper into this subject, that there is so much more. It's literally like what most people do is the top of the iceberg, but like
mm,
everyone, male and female, please dive. And I think there is so much both pain and joy and pleasure and self-love that can be found if you dive in there, because I truly feel that sexuality is such an important power and such an important part of us,
mm.
and not necessarily as sex but as sexuality, and
Yeah.
to learn to be with yourself. And you can do that on your own. That's a beautiful thing. But something else happens if you do that in polarity, doesn't matter the sex, the
Mm.
female, masculine. And I really want people to explore that and to get to know themselves. And like, again, like as a female, I can say like we often are like criticizing men for like, yeah, you don't know what the clitoris is, or you don't know how to make us come. Okay, great. How good are you at making yourself come? Have you really
I
explored
was
that?
gonna say, how many men understand their hormonal cycle? Like when a man starts to go, oh, in France, there's a lot of gender jokes. It's still quite macho, so it's a lot of like, oh, elle a ses règles, she's got her period. I usually say to them, like, do you realize that you are on your death valley since you started wanking at the age of 11? You are literally in your hormonal death valley your whole life. And have you any idea what that means on your mood? And they're like, what? Because they
Yeah.
don't understand their own hormonal cycle. So when I was in university, I studied the female menstrual cycle to understand the hormonal changes. And I realized there was not a single line in the textbook about men's hormonal balance. So I started looking it up and realized that it's a very underreported and under-researched topic, which of course in Tantra is taught in some Tantra schools, particularly the Taoist ones, but it's not at all common knowledge. So guys often literally say to me that their only form of orgasm is an ejaculatory orgasm, that their pleasure is based on being hard. Well, the first thing we do when we frame our polarity evenings is we say, even if somebody does go into sex play, the number one thing is that indication of somebody being excited is not their level of hardness. And that goes to women and to men, because the men feel a tremendous pressure for having to display their excitement, which generally they find hard in a public, intimate context because they feel
Yeah.
vulnerable. And then women who say to them, oh, but you're not hard, therefore you're not excited, amplify that problem. So we cut that out by saying, excitement is not to do with your outward display of excitement. It's a psychological state that only you know is or not. And therefore,
Yeah.
let's remove that pressure from each other and start really going into what is the somatic experience of being excited. And men start to then take their journey of feeling inside their body what's happening. And some of them get very, very uncomfortable because they realize that their whole time they've been in a performance mode where their main goal is to please the woman. And if she's not being able to communicate with them, then they don't understand how, and they're disconnected from their self completely. In those sex parties, I think that's the most common issue I see, is that guys are so busy trying to please that they actually have no idea what they want and how to receive pleasure themselves, even though the porn gives us a very different narrative of guys standing back and waiting for people, particularly women, to do all the work. In what I notice in those parties is exactly the opposite, is that the men are terrified of performing badly and not giving enough pleasure, actually. So there's a sort of messed up, idealized view through porn, reality which is often less glamorous. And in between that, I think there's a space of individual experience which is completely unique and difficult for people to really talk about, which is where I started doing these men's group, where now I started to hear a lot of guys talking. They need to do that in the safety of being within a small group, no recording. I stopped the whole thing about recording, even with audio, and just being like with a very, very select small group of trusted friends
Yeah.
where they can be vulnerable.
And what I find most interesting actually about what you're saying, because I think this is an extremely important topic, is like, it's like in the Buddhism you have like the golden middle way, that this is
Mm.
actually two sides of the road, because there's them that are completely unaware that just do porn sex, which I don't think exists, but and the other one that are extremely aware. And
Mm.
I have also been to like different fetish parties, and also like with rooms where people could just enjoy themselves in a sex positive way. And I've seen the same, where men really, really wanted to perform. And actually I remember one time I think I was a teenager, to be honest, like 18 or 19, and I were being intimate with this man, guy or whatever, and he said to me like, for someone that's a good looking person, you're actually good in bed. And I was like, what does that mean? And he was like, most girls or women that are good looking, they do the starfish because they think it's just enough to lay there and look good. And I was like, what the fuck? And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
talked to other men about that is actually a thing.
Mm,
And I think again, because like, of course, we get wet. That's also a measurable thing. But like for men, it is so obvious if you are excited or not in like the normal way of thinking. So for sure, I so agree with you. But what I think is interesting, I was almost getting out of that, is what is on the middle road? Like, what is
mm,
the more healthy way, and how do we, as both facilitators, get people there? How do you bring awareness
mm.
of an a harmonious, a balanced way?
It's I think this was really the core of why I wanted to have these conversations with you, Gitte, because I think that middle way starts from understanding that no matter what the pain, because I could go on about the pain of being gendered as a child. You could
Yeah,
talk about other pains. I could borrow the pain from men and start to make the case why some men are victims as well as women. You could do the same. I could even go into history, which I've studied extensively on the history of gender, and show that the majority of our history, if you count prehistory as history, has been a matrifocal society. And we know what that also did in its excesses. So there is there is all sorts of reasons why we could justify past inertia. There's also many reasons why we could justify the pain that anybody comes to the table with and says, I think the number one job for us in ourselves and with others as facilitators is to acknowledge that pain exists, but to not create identity out of it.
yeah,
Because the minute we create identity out of the pain and be the victim of a gender, a society, a culture, we disempower ourselves from doing anything about it constructively. So even though we can make the case for pain and the pain needs to be addressed, and it is for the person feeling pain, it is a very real thing. I want to, with you, maybe play the game of respecting the pains and the victimhoods wherever they may be, but looking for the middle ground through a sense of forgiveness, respect of the pain, but without making it the core emphasis of change. That the change is not because of avoidance of pain or removing pain, but the core middle line, I think, could be around love and the beautiful things that can come out in whatever gender roles we take, in whatever polarity roles we take, to start interacting as two, three, four, five, a collective of humans with a healthy and harmonious and respectful polarity. I think that's the middle road that is really hard because it's much more tempting to go back into our pains individually and go, I'm talking from the pain and therefore I'm insecure in this moment. I have a performance issue because of my past pain in my last party, whatever. It's not going to help anybody, including our own selves, to go. So that's
no.
kind of where I'm going with this, is to invite us to acknowledge the pains, acknowledge the victimhoods, but not come from that space for future present.
Yeah, yeah, and I so agree. And I think also it's actually interesting how deeply embedded it is, because I'm going to be really honest right now. So when you started saying that, yeah, I could go back in history, I was literally, a part of me inside was like, okay, you want to go there, bring it on. And I was just like,
But
whoa,
we
where did
can.
that come from?
We could, and it would be very interesting. I don't think many people have really studied the history of the mythology of sex and how it's been different in different civilizations and how it's been to what it is today. It's not only a history of patriarchy. There's
I
also
was
many,
just
many matriarchal.
was just also like, who are the are, are there one real victim or like oppressor here, and like what is the difference? Because like
Mm,
I actually get a little triggered by hashtag not all men,
mm,
and also what you said about rape. It's like I totally agree that it is perhaps a bigger taboo to be a rape victim as a man. But I think,
mm,
like, I don't know the specific statistic, but I think it's like 7% of all rape victims are men. So like, why should these 7% have just as much speaking time as the 93?
mm,
For me, I'm like, okay, come on, because every time there is a rape discussion, there is some dude that says like men also get raped, and I'm like, yes, I'm not saying that they're not. I'm not saying that they're sorry. I'm saying we have an issue in the society because rape is happening. and
mm, mm,
mostly for women. So I just got triggered by like, it's difficult, even for me. I can just say, I don't know about you, to not go into that pain, to not do that negative
mm,
polarization. But I agree, I want us to not necessarily go there. We can have talks like
mm.
this for sure, but it is more interesting, instead of going to the mountaintop screaming at each other, to figure out like, where do we actually meet? What is your way down? What
Let's
is my way?
crawl
Yeah,
down into the
right?
jungle, into the darker jungle where not everything is so clear as from the mountaintop. And by the way, thank you for being vulnerable and saying that you got triggered, because I think that's a huge sign of courage. It's difficult to be triggered and to not take it as an immediate like knee jerk reaction. So I think there's maybe a structure that we could use to move into something harmonious over the next few sessions. Like, um, I like physical challenges, and I think you do too with your Wim Hof background. There's like
Yeah,
something around the somatic experience of cold and being in the real versus thinking about having a cold shower or a cold bath. Actually doing
yeah,
it is quite different, and I think the red thread through this could be that if we have these 5 sessions.
yeah.
I'm just going to zoom in a second so that you can,
Do
maybe
it.
you can see. Call
I
to
can see it.
adventures today. So it's like, why are we doing this? What's the adventure? I would say the first session we could do could be on vertical exploration, meaning parent-child relationships, vertical intergenerational topic. The third session could be around horizontal with peers, people of the same social bubble and experience. Fourth could be where we get creative with what we do. And the fifth could be a ritual where we actually together, on behalf of the big agenda. So, in other words, you representing the sacred feminine, me representing the sacred masculine, without it going to our heads and taking a big ego around it, but more just like playing with that middle path of perhaps forgiveness
Yeah,
or harmony or peace or love. What could we do online to symbolically ritualize that on behalf of other people who might resonate or not with this? And with that vertical exploration, I was thinking that it would be nice to go out with a question. So those sessions, date wise, they're going to be, I think we've already booked them in the calendar as 11 o'clock finish time each one. Like, so today's the 30th. The next one is this week on the 1st, 6th of November, 8th of November, 13th of November. So it's quite close together. So it gives us a relatively fast drumbeat of challenges.
yeah. No, I
So
am up for it. I think also because, like, I think doing challenges in that way, it's way easier to lie to yourself when you just do like a mental exercise, when you
mm,
need to go in and feel your body. For me, that's also about the Wim Hof method, is it just gives you a different answer.
yeah. So here's my embryonic challenges that I had. Because by the way, this idea has been in my head for months, and I've been testing this with guys. I was even going to do this with a bunch of guys, but calendar wise, it was challenging. So decided to just do this myself with you. That we would have our own playground, which is not dependent on other people's calendar. But the first challenge could be that we go out with a very open question to somebody that we identify as a vertical and maybe older referent person who's influenced our gender roles, gender views, gender roles. So in my case, it could be my father and his wife. My mother passed away. Obviously, she influenced my gender roles a lot. But I'm going to be able to talk with my father, and I know that he's open to have those kind of conversations. So my suggestion here would be that we would both, between now and the next session, um, go and talk to one of our vertical reference. So it could be parent, could be an uncle, aunt, or even a figure that's influenced as a mentor who's older than us, and who we could ask the very candid question of twofold. Like, okay, you hear a lot about these gender roles and the shift in patriarchy becoming less toxic, hopefully, and masculinity, and however way you frame it, but asking them, in your opinion, what is a good thing to keep with gender roles from the past, and what is one thing that you feel is needing to be changed. So, like, to keep and to change. And I think that should open up with a couple of open prompts a pretty interesting conversation. And the job for us, the challenge for us would be to not influence them by agreeing or disagreeing, but by being entirely
Yeah.
empathic, going like, okay, what do you think and why this, and open on their side.
I actually think, because I have the big privilege of being a mother to two beautiful daughters, and one is actually in her 20s, the other one is becoming a teenager next week. Um, and to be honest, in regard of gender roles, both of them are so inspiring for me, like really. And I'm just gonna share like a little fun story. I don't know, like in Denmark, I think also you do it in other countries. When I grew up, everyone was like, hey man, or what's up, dude, or hey guys, still used. My youngest daughter, she's using girl. And one time I was traveling actually to London with my older brother, and he was like raising a hat, and she shouted throughout the entire airport, wait up, girl. And people were being like, what? And like realizing, because he stopped and said something like, what the fuck? That was so much not okay. And I was just like laughing, like tears were running down my cheeks, because I thought it was so hilarious, because it's
Mm.
also a bit triggering. But also I was like, sis, I was just gonna say man, girl. That was so inspiring that she actually changed that word. And for her, it's actually not even a trigger, or she wants to do something. That's just something that she's doing.
So
So
you would talk to the younger generation. I would talk to the older generation. Should we do
we
that?
can do that. Yeah,
I can
wouldn't
also
that
talk
be
to my
awesome?
children. Time wise, I don't think I have time to do both, but I could also talk to my two children who are at the moment in very different parts of the world. So they're seeing also a different cultural perspective on gender. So I might still actually talk to them as well. But Ilyas is in Egypt, where gender roles are quite different to Finland, and Elena is in Jakarta, where also gender roles are slightly different. We've been talking about this already since they've arrived there. So, do you have your parents still?
Yeah, I do. I actually do. And like I'm living, my parents are divorced since I was a child, but I'm very close, both like close but also like physical. But my mother, she's like literally like less than a mile away from me. But actually I'm like, when you said like I can do the younger, I'm like, actually I want to ask my parents about this. I think it's interesting to hear what they
It's interesting
actually
both
think about it.
because yeah, because the parents are also taking a step from a very different mindset in history than we are, even in our generation. So I think it would be nice to see both. But we have a session on Wednesday. So before the next Monday, we could try and do both the parents and the children and see how we get on and just like have a casual conversation with them with the idea of just opening up insights or perspectives from them about what should change, what should be kept with gender roles,
Yeah.
and see really what they come up with. And they might surprise us in many different ways, both sides. And then we could debrief that in our next session and see like what we learn from that.
I can absolutely do it to Wednesday, because like for me it's just like that's how I am. My parents don't find it weird if I call them and say like I'm gonna ask you something.
All
So
right, deal. I'll do that same too. I can't promise I'll speak to both my children before if I don't manage to
no,
get
no.
through, but I will also try and see. Then on Wednesday we can start by debriefing what we learned, and then
Yeah.
figure out our next challenge on that journey of introspective gender harmonization or something. I don't know.
Yeah. I think that's a good one. And also I think I have, but that's not, but that's also, this is by the way not a, like a bodily one. This is a mental one. But I don't have like a more like somatic
I was
exercise.
going to throw the I was going to throw a physical one next on the horizontal level, um, and I think it could be interesting to do a horizontal exploration on a more somatic level. Meaning, I think we should both cross dress, but I don't mean cross dress with clothes. I think we should go out into a particular place where gender is a huge issue. So I'm going to probably go to a sex party dressed as a woman, and I'm going to invite you to do something equally vulnerable, dressed, but not just dressed. I mean, because you can dress as a man and feel very feminine, and I can dress as a woman and feel very masculine. I'm inviting that to be an embodiment challenge of seeing how it feels, and particularly the social dimension to that, like how do people react, and seeing also what is feeling in our heads, what's the mental narrative, and see if there's any insights from that. And that would give us the weekend to go off and do that.
I would say both yes and no, but what I also think is the truth is that wouldn't be a first for any of us. So I think,
Well,
if is there a way we could challenge ourselves even more?
I go ahead. Maybe we can do that next time and think about it. For me, that is very challenging. That is
Yeah, but
really
it is,
challenging.
but I can say that because I was a lot into my masculine energy, being like this straightforward, and also I think
Mm,
like a lot of girls in the north are more like masculine in a way, that
mm,
I wanted to make sure that I was really well connected with the masculinity inside of me. So I have done like different, like, I wouldn't call them meditation, but like sessions with myself where I really connected in with my masculine. And like, okay, like this next Wim Hof method workshop I'm doing it from a male perspective. This next
mm,
one I'm doing for feminine, also with, I also am a yoga therapist. So I have
mm.
really explored this in a lot of ways. And for me, like, yeah, we can talk about it, but we could talk about it just now. So something else, but we can think about it.
That's a good point. I think we should sit on that, brew it, and as we debrief the sessions with our parents and children, I think we might get a somatic challenge that becomes clearer. If not, we already have some ideas. And I think what we could do for today is do a quick checkout so that we can land on where we are for the next session, and then pick up from the next session on talking about what happened in those conversations that we have with our parents and children. So my checkout question is like, what are you taking away from today? What am I taking away from today? We can both answer the same question, and that will be our checkout. How
Yeah,
does that
I
sound?
love that. It's great, amazing. I think I always love to do these, like, yeah, check out things. I also do that when I teach. I
Mm-hmm.
think actually more for me, the most important point or like highlight I want to bring or emphasize is the importance of not being a victim, not
Mm-hmm.
staying on the mountaintop, but actually, again, like, let's find a way to actually come down and explore the jungle together
Mm.
from love.
Mm. Beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Normally, I don't comment on other people's checkouts if I'm coaching, but here I just feel like we can
Do
do
it.
that without being triggering. It was beautiful. I think that's actually something I was taking away as well. But the other one is that I think my takeaway is that those topics, whether we want it or not, whether I want it or not, whether I'm a peaceful person identifying to a harmonious gender person, are opening up pain in myself, in
Mhm.
others, in women, in men, in old people, young people, and it's inevitable. And I think I need to just forgive myself for occasionally triggering you, other people, even when the intention is not at all the triggeringness. It's the intention is to sort of go into that middle road of love and harmony. That triggering will happen, and I need to be okay with it. Otherwise, I don't have a role to play in this conversation. So that's my takeaway from today.
No, yeah, I really love that. And for me, that's actually also a really important topic. And also, I feel like now I want to step into the coaching role because, like, this is an important topic for me, but I think I'll not.
Well, we can
And
do that next time. We can do a little bit of mutual coaching. I think that's good as well.
yeah, that could be interesting. I think actually, so many of us are afraid of what we're doing with other people. And
Mm,
it's never the conscious things that we're doing that's wrong. It's, again, the
mm,
unconscious thing. And I think pain is part of life. And we all have pain, and pain is not necessarily a bad thing. And I can say, like, I also am into plant medicine. And a lot of the plant medicine journeys I have had have been extremely painful. Like, I'm almost every time I go really deep, I'm like having moments where I'm like, fuck you, you're an idiot. Why are you doing this? I'm never gonna do it again. This is awful. I'm hating it. It's so painful. I'm crying and shaking. But every time also, I am so extremely grateful that I have the opportunity to actually have the courage to feel that pain, to look at that pain, to relieve that pain. So I don't think it's a bad thing actually sometimes to address the pain, even if it's painful for others.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I couldn't
I
help
will
myself.
I will take that away as a reassurance of being in that space of feeling, holding the pain, and forgiving myself and the pain itself. So, Gitte, I will bid you a lovely end of day and Tuesday, and we shall see on Wednesday morning at 11 o'clock after having spoken to some other people.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much for the coffee chat.
Thank you as well. Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too.